Listo. All right.
Should we begin? Okay, so a very warm welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on wherever you are. I know for some of you it's really early, so thanks for being flexible and making time to be part of this dialogue on democracy and power, despair and hope, a dialogue that is much needed for our times. I'm Srishti Bajpayee. I'm an activist researcher from India, work on environment and social justice issues, and part of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives process, a process that is attempting to connect a number of radical alternatives and initiatives together. Um, the interpretations for today's dialogue are available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. So please use the globe icon that is in the bottom of your screens for your language interpretation. And Rosie will mention the others as well. While the dialogue is on, please keep your if any thoughts or comments come to your mind, please do mention in your chat, which we will ask our panel to respond to later, and we can come back to those discussions at the latter part of the dialogue. Now, today's dialogue is being co-organized by a number of global processes, the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, the World Social Forum, Towards a New World Social Forum, Global Dialogue for Systemic Change, Global Working Group Beyond Development, Global Green New Deal, Progressive International, and Grassroots to Global Assemblies. And the intention of this dialogue is to have open conversation where we can critically address some of the very important issues related to power and democracy, especially from two perspectives. One within the whole framework of the nation state, looking at the issues of representative democracy, its crisis of legitimacy, and increasing fascist tendencies. And the second, very grounded radical democracy and direct democracy practices that are challenging the state and emerging from the ground, and what kind of radical transformations and frameworks are emerging. So to facilitate today's discussion, we have Ashish Kothari. He's a well-known environment activist, member of an environment action group, Kalpavich in India, helps in coordinating alternatives confluence process Vikalp Sangam in India, and also part of the global tapestry of alternatives. Ashish, over to you. Just a request to all the speakers to be slow so that the interpretations can happen smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you, Srishti. Before I start, we had a request if somebody could help translate from Portuguese and Spanish into English in the chat box for Sherween, one of our panelists, whose interpretation room is not working. So if any of you can just put main points spoken in Portuguese or Spanish into English in the chat, that would be very useful. Thank you. So the topic today, power and democracy, despair and hope. I think all of us are seeing across the world, wherever we are, a very serious crisis of legitimacy, of democracy as we've known it in the recent times. We're seeing both in countries and at the level of the global international organizations such as the UN, that we've had a history of both some positive measures that nation states and the United Nations systems can take in terms of welfare, human rights, and so on, but also significant failures to deal with fundamental issues like inequality, climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, regulating the completely unregulated imperialism or hegemonies of many powers, and so on. We've also seen in the last few decades, especially, how economic globalization has created enormous insecurity and vulnerability, not just amongst those who were already on the margins, but even those who considered themselves to be somewhat part of the benefited classes or the privileged classes, such that only maybe 1 to 5% of the world is today seemingly secure in terms of livelihoods and many other aspects of life, including psychological. Um, Now, the kind of responses to this kind of marginalization or the creation of what some people are calling the precariat, which is precarious ways of living, which have especially got highlighted during the COVID pandemic. I think there are three kinds of responses, and this panel will hopefully help us to go deeper into these and the relationship amongst them. One kind is the demand to reinstate the welfare and the rights guaranteeing role of the nation state. And so sometimes, for instance, when we see a shift, which is a very, very relative shift from, say, Trump to Biden, people heave a sigh of relief because they feel that there will be at least some more welfare measures, some more of the state to help guarantee rights. The second kind of response is unfortunately common, which is to bring in authoritarian parties, especially strong men who people feel will be able to set society right. And the third, which is possibly the most hopeful one, is where people are trying to claim or reclaim power on the ground, take back control over their lives in collective ways, in various different ways of expressing deliberative, radical democracy on the ground. In all of these, the very crucial questions of power and democracy, the notions of power, for instance, is it power over, that is the power to dominate, or can we think of power with and power to, in which all of us, it's not a zero sum game, in which in fact we use all of our inherent powers to for emancipation. Um, the crisis, the question with regard to the role of the state is also something that has been thrown up in all of these events and discussions in the last few decades, in the last few years especially. Is there a legitimate role for the state? What would be that role, if at all? So, some of the most exciting things that are actually happening on the ground, and some of our panelists represent those movements, are the ones where communities, collectives in villages, in cities are claiming power, as I mentioned earlier. You can have examples like a bunch of villages in central India claiming that where they are in their villages, they are the government and they will be taking all the decisions and also making those who are sitting in New Delhi in the so called corridors of power, making them accountable. Or we can have much larger visions and practices of radical democracy, such as the Zapatista and the one that Sherwin on our panel represents today, the Kurdish Rojava movement. The combination of feminist, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, and radical democratic movements, and of course ecological movements in many parts of the world. The movements for indigenous self-determination in Latin America, in Canada, in Australia, in parts of Africa. The movements for citizens' assemblies in cities trying to claim or reclaim the right to govern and manage cities. All of these provide very important lessons and clues to us on how we can, in a sense, challenge the kind of capitalist or statist domination of our lives, which has been allowed to happen in liberal democracies. Maybe liberal democracy is kind of even oriented towards that. Challenge the very central role of the state and of the capitalist corporation. But also lessons on how do we then organize ourselves on the ground? How do we deal with issues of social injustice, which can sometimes get even increase when there's local radical democracy, if there isn't a simultaneous movement for social justice, equality, and so on. And a very crucial question, how do we look at current nation state political boundaries, many of which are accidents of history, many of which are results of colonialism. If you look at the way Africa was divided up into countries, for instance, or some parts of South Asia, can we go beyond that? Can we look at, for instance, ecological contiguity and cultural contiguity and relations, and think of ecoregions and bioregions beyond the nation state boundaries? So these are all very crucial questions that have come up in, as I said, in the last few decades, and especially the last few years. And we're hoping that this very exciting panel that we have today with us will help us to go deeper into understanding, if not necessarily answering, all these questions. The way we're going to do it is not long speeches. I will be posing two sets of questions to each of the panelists, and they'll get a certain amount of time to respond to them. And we hope that we'll finish all of this in about an hour, so that we have at least an hour left for an open discussion with the rest of you as participants. So let me start, and I will introduce each of them as I ask the first question. Let's start with Kali. Kali Akuno has been at the center of the anti-racist movement in the United States, but is also very well known to be an organizer of the cooperative movement, of trying to bring back control over the economy into the local community, especially marginalized local communities. He's the co-founder of a very interesting initiative called Cooperation Jackson, which attempts to advocate and practice these things. He's also the co-director of the US Human Rights Network, and has for a long time played this very interesting interface between cooperative economics, politics, and social justice. So Kali, let me start with you and ask you very quickly, maybe just in 2 or 3 minutes, if you can say something further about the relationship of your work with the topic of today, especially with radical democracy and the state.
No problem. No problem. First off, good morning to many, good day. Some of you in other areas. Pleasure to be here. In the short amount of time that I have, I would say, I mean, our project has been much more focused in the long term around transforming society and democratizing society through the institution of people's assemblies. And these assemblies are attempts at local grassroots direct democracy and self-governance. And for us, that means kind of two things relative to our work. One, there is kind of a consistent relationship of either trying to contain the state or to make certain demands of it, particularly for it to fulfill its role in kind of being a guarantor of rights. But then there's another component of it, which is trying to organize our community so that they do not only acts of kind of self-governance, but self-administration of actually putting their ideas directly into practice and executing them through their own resources. And so that is the critical kind of dual component of the People's Assembly work that we've been working at constructing here in Jackson for now well over close to almost 2 decades, with some of the antecedents of that going back even further to almost 40 years now. And we've very consciously and deliberately tried to intervene in the state and to try to transform it on a local municipal level, and tried to get it to curtail many of its kind of repressive functions, the police in particular, and what they do in our communities, how they confine and constrain and attack our communities, but to also to open up certain avenues so that the social movements can take more of a direct role in kind of administering economic affairs or in doing conflict mediation within our communities. So these are some critical pieces that Cooperation Jackson and the broader kind of social democratic movement in Jackson, Mississippi have been there for quite some time.
Thanks, Kali, and I'm going to come back to you in the next round on specifically the issues of power, how you look at power, and how that's emerged in the activism that you've done. Fascinating, thank you. I'm going to go to Ruth now. Ruth Nambura is a Kenyan feminist. She is, I think, one of the founders of the African Eco-Feminist Collective. She's a researcher, she's an organizer, she's especially been focusing on agrarian political economy and political ecology. Ruth, over to you, the same question. How does your work relate to the topic of today in 2 or 3 minutes?
Thank you so much. So I will basically center my response to the work of the African Ecofeminist Collective, which is a transnational African feminist collective of organizers, researchers who work on the intersections of ecological justice, challenging patriarchy, challenging homophobia, challenging the ecological destruction that we see, but also moving through a politics of regeneration. And I'd say that for us as the African Ecofeminist Collective, our central point in terms of addressing the state has been thinking through political education. And I say this is absolutely important for us because we live in a continent where, and of course, this is not particular to the continent of Africa, but everything we see in terms of a politics of ecology, majority of it comes in the form of NGOization, capacity building projects, very depoliticized capacity building projects, education systems.
Ruth,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt. A little slower, please, for the interpreters.
All right. Okay. So basically, the African Ecofeminist Collective has been working through a politics of political education. We're working in terms of resourcing movements for the kind of liberatory work that we need to see. So we come from a context of NGOization of the kind of work that we do, capacity building projects that really championed in the form of NGO, depoliticized NGO work, coming from depoliticized educational systems, living through the afterlives of colonization, neoliberalism, the rolling back of the state. And so for us, for the Ecofeminist Collective, radical feminist political education and also popular education has been very central for us, in terms of resourcing movements to first of all understand the structure of the state, to understand the long histories of the state, to understand the long histories of colonization, and for us to be able to understand how we find ourselves in an ecological crisis and what that means to us, right? Including what is being pushed forward in terms of the techno fixes, the false solutions to the climate crisis that continue to center so-called solutions within, the market, rather than, a radical shift from the kind of economic structures and political structures that we find ourselves in. So that has been very central for us. And, it has focused on unpacking the grand narratives of power, right, in multiple arenas, becoming fluent in each other's histories, the intergenerational histories across this continent, and not just intergeneration, but also, the transnational histories of this continent, also dialogues across difference and power, of course, right? And also thinking through a politics of regenerative politics. How do we think about regeneration, a politics of life, a politics of health, a politics of healing and joy, celebration, rest, tenderness, and of course, a politics of the commons. So this is how the Ecofeminist Collective that I'm part of is thinking through questions of power, questions of the state, and how to radically transform ourselves, our communities, and the societies that we find ourselves in.
Thanks, Ruth. And I will also be coming back to you especially on that last part that you just said, so that you can elaborate that further in the next round. Let's go to Sherwin Nudem. Sherwin is currently in and part of the Kurdish women's liberation movement in the Rojava area of that extremely conflict-ridden zone where they've been trying to create a zone of eco-feminist radical democracy peace. Is quite a remarkable, to me, not that I've been there, but from afar it looks like one of the most inspiring large-scale movements in the world. Shervin is with the Genealogy Academy. The genealogy spelled here is Jineoloji, which is the local version of eco-feminist ideology. Maybe she can explain that later. She has been very much into popular education, into community-based research on the history and the dynamics of the women's revolution and of the democratic autonomy movement in that region. Shervin, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work relates to today's topic, briefly?
I will try to make it briefly. At first, many greetings of solidarity from the Genealogy Academy in Rojava. I don't know how much you know about the situation here and about the building up process of democratic autonomy. But I think it's important to emphasize that it's not a zone that we try to create, but we have been involved in the process of building up a self-organization in society, which is based on the pillars of radical democracy, ecology, and gender liberation. So actually the system of people's assemblies, of popular education, that also the other two friends were mentioning are also a part of this process here. And actually in Rojava, we see, which is the name of West Kurdistan, as Kurdistan was divided through colonial occupation of the Middle East in 4 parts and the establishment of a nation state. These dividing borders, we want to lift among the people. We want to make them meaningless and to connect the building up processes as well as our struggles for a just and world. And it's, yeah, we can really see how much destruction has been created by nation state ideology and borders, which how it has divided families, put them on different parts of the borders, how it has destroyed communities. And this process is going on until today. And we really clearly saw also, especially with the last occupation attacks of the Turkish state on the town of Afrin, on Serekani, on Girsipi, which were carried out in front of the eyes of the public and were against all international laws and UN conventions, but still the state of occupation on Afrin, on Serekani, on different regions is continuing. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, but in spite of this, we are continuing with a process of building up alternatives in society. Maybe shortly about what are concretely our works as genealogy. Genealogy means science of women, life and society, and it has been developed in the context of the women's liberation struggle in Kurdistan. And our approach has always been a women's liberation cannot be postponed after the revolution. And more than this, it is autonomous women's organizing is actually the foundation of radical democratic changes in society. And it is also the basis for fighting patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, state powers, and all forms of oppression. So therefore, also the women's movement in Kurdistan has organized itself in many fields, like from local women's communes and councils to cooperatives, academies, and maybe, as you know, as women's self-defense units, which became known in the public by the resistance and the victory in Kobani against Daesh, against ISIS. But at the same time, while we have to resist at many fronts at the same time, like the building up process, while we were trying to develop alternative forms of education, have a different understanding of arts and culture, finding out about our politics on health and justice, and create alternatives, because many things are not available here due to embargo and war and closed borders. We have actually realized that the revolution has to start in our own minds. So if we want to build up a free life, free relations, a free society that does not reproduce the power structures, we have to think and learn to know and live in a different way. And in this context, our works at the Généalogie Academy have been we are making with the aim to collect and connect women's wisdom and knowledge to share and develop analysis for succeeding a women's revolution. What we call a women's revolution actually means a process of organizing, of creating awareness and social transformation. And it means also to overcome state-like structures in our daily lives, in our own habits and in our minds. So actually the things that Ruth were mentioning, I think there's a very close connection also on with the ecofeminism in Africa and the roots they connect to.
Sherwin, can I get back to you in the next round, because I think you'll definitely get a chance to go a bit further into this. This first one, we just wanted to make a very short kind of introductory thing. Is that okay?
Okay, it's fine. Just one last sentence I would like to say that it is that we follow our works with the aim to strengthen women's autonomy, democratic structures and mentality in society. And this is the basis or focus of popular education, women's and men and research works.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. We move now to Pedro Pontual. Pedro is the honorary president of the Council of Popular Education of Latin America, and has also been very active in the Latin American campaign for the right to education. I believe he worked with Paulo Freire and also with some of the Brazilian administrations in trying to adopt or push for radically different forms of education. So Pedro also comes from that perspective of popular education, of radical education. Pedro, can you please tell us a little bit about how your work relates to today's topic? You will be speaking in Portuguese, I think.
Sim. O CEAL, Conselho de Educação Popular da América Latina e do Caribe, é um movimento de educação popular, de educadores e educadoras, movimentos sociais, organizações, que já existe há 40 anos, né, e que se dedicam a práticas de educação popular, né, inspiradas na pedagogia de Paulo Freire, né? E em toda a região, né? Eu vivo no Brasil e, portanto, pertenço ao coletivo do CEAL no Brasil, né? Dentre os vários temas que o CEAL se dedica, né, como, por exemplo, a educação em direitos humanos, educação em economia solidária, educação feminista e antipatriarcal, educação e juventude, né, educação de jovens e adultos. Eu me dedico particularmente ao tema da educação e formação política, junto a movimentos sociais e governos progressistas, né? É daí que vem a minha experiência por ter atuado sempre tanto junto a movimentos sociais quanto a experiência de governos progressistas, tanto a nível de governos locais quanto na experiência que nós tivemos a nível do governo federal, né? Nós consideramos, né, que a educação popular, né, é um elemento fundamental para a construção da democracia, né? a construção, né, de uma contra-hegemonia, né, popular, né, é um elemento fundamental para a remoção do fascismo, né? E, portanto, fazer um trabalho permanente, né, de educação popular junto às diversas práticas, né, de organização popular é um elemento central para a possibilidade de consolidação das experiências de democracia radical. Então, é isso a minha contribuição inicial.
Gracias, Pedro. We will come back to you on some of those issues of popular education and how that relates to radical democracy. We move now on to Eva Schonveld. Eva is with one of the 7 global processes that is putting this webinar together, the Grassroots to Global Assemblies. She's also been active with the Extinction Rebellion Scotland, which is where she's based, and has been focusing a lot on deliberative assembly processes in cities, as far as I know. So, Eva, can you tell us a little bit more and how it relates to our topic today?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here and great to hear what the other speakers have had to say. And actually, there feels like there's so much alignment already in what we're saying. Our project is looking at sort of broadly who makes decisions and how, and is asking a kind of.
Desligar? Não está conseguindo acompanhar nada?
Não estou em outra língua.
Go ahead.
Pedro, fecha o telefone. Isso, ok.
All right. And we're also asking, can we make better collective decisions without necessarily starting with any view on what those decisions ought to be? So the background of our project is, well, it comes from many different roots, but it kind of most recently comes from the experience of being part of the Extinction Rebellion and the 3 demands that they had for governments to tell the truth, to act now, and to create a citizens' assembly to look at how to solve climate change at a national level. And in the UK and in Scotland, we got at least 2 of our 3 demands. They declared climate emergencies, and they both governments in different ways created citizens' assemblies. But watching how that played out, it became very clear that our governments are not capable of taking the issue of climate change seriously. They're part of the system that is creating it. And it was very clear to us that the governmental route is not one that we can take when we're looking at this massive emergency that we're all facing. But at the same time, we had been exposed to experience of citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies and seen how well they work, which has been reflected in what the other speakers have been saying, that people coming together with good information and good facilitation step up to the responsibility in a really fantastic way and use kind of creative thinking in completely new ways. So we realized that we were starting from a position of being climate change activists, and the people we were speaking to were mostly climate change activists who all agreed with one another. So we wanted to reach out further and realized that what we had to do was to drop our emergency, because it was stopping us from seeing what was important to other people and why they weren't seeing it as the same emergency. And of course, what we see is that there are lots of emergencies happening all at the same time for different people in different places. There's mental health emergencies all over. People are not feeling safe. There's huge poverty, racism, there's health inequalities, there's land grabs. We know that, we know the picture of the world that we're looking at. but what happens when you drop your what happened for us when we dropped our agenda and wanted to hear from other people what their problems were, was that the conversation just changed radically, and we started to see the connections between all these emergencies that happen at the systemic level, and basically the system of capitalism, the system of the kind of that we've inherited from the incredibly awful colonial period, has been busy causing all these problems for us. So we're starting to work in Scotland, currently in 3 cities, and looking for more, to run very grassroots people's assemblies, and to look at what is needed to re-engage people who in our country have been very strongly disengaged from politics and political processes, and then also to reach out internationally, to talk to people who are already doing these things in their communities, seeing what works, whether it's these kind of modern citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies, or whether it's traditional practices that have been done for centuries, if not millennia. And we're inviting people to come to a gathering at the end of May, an online gathering where we can have those conversations. We can find out what are the principles that underlie these different ways of doing things, because we're never going to find one size that fits all. But we're looking for whether we can create collective processes that go beyond our communities and our national boundaries, and that allow us to come together as a globe to tackle these high-level issues like climate change and neoliberal capitalism. That we really want to create processes that can enable us to challenge the legitimacy of the governments that we currently have, because they're so well done. So we're learning how to the different ways that we can create decision-making processes that really involve people and tap into that collective genius that people can have, and reaching possibly for a global citizens' assembly or some kind of democratic process at the end of 2022, when COP, as it will inevitably, fails, and make that a moment of challenge around contesting where the legitimacy to make collective decisions lies.
Thanks, Eva. I'll come back to you. Yesterday, there was a session also at the World Social Forum on a global citizens' parliament. Maybe that idea also, its potential and pitfalls can come into this discussion later. I'm going to move to Boaventura. Boaventura de Souza Santos is a very well-known academic intellectual scholar in the, especially in the field of decolonizing epistemologies, sort of breaking down the Western notions of democracy, there's many different ways to introduce him, but he's emeritus professor of sociology in the University of Coimbra in Portugal. He's also distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Boa, over to you for this question.
Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, with such wonderful people and some very old friends. Well, my trajectory as a kind of a rearguard intellectual with 50% of my time in activism and 50% in academic life has 3 characteristics that, in a sense, will anticipate what I'll be saying in the following, later on the second question. I've been, of course, very much interested in working with the social movements. I created in the World Social Forum in 2003 the Popular University of the Social Movements. And this is an initiative of popular education, very much influenced by Paulo Freire, of course, updated to our current needs, and in which we are trying to bring together academic knowledge and popular knowledges. And it was created by this double request that we found in the first meetings of the World Social Forum. On one side, a cleavage, an abyss between academic knowledge and popular knowledge, and also a very, very large difference among different knowledges, women's knowledges, indigenous knowledges, urban knowledges, peasant knowledge, so to overcome that. The second one has been to working with the nation, the state at the municipal level. So I started a project in Porto Alegre, you know, the city where the World Social Forum was founded in 2001. From 1989 on, we in the West, it was the first experience of participatory budgeting at the municipal level. So I was very active in launching and in working with and doing research with, collaborative research, with the participatory project budget in this case. And thirdly, I have not given up the idea of the state, of transforming the state. I was consultant to the Constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador during an attempt for a plurinational state. And in fact, I continue to do so. In 3 hours' time, I'll be giving a presentation and working with the Colombian Constitutional Court on my topic, which has been the rights of the indigenous peoples in Latin America and how we can transform the monocultural state into a plurinational state. So that's it.
Thanks, Boa. Short and succinct. And finally, we move to Arturo Escobar. Arturo is a Colombian activist, researcher, very prominent work on struggles against extractivist development, on post-development, post-capitalism, and so on. He was till recently at the University of North Carolina and now teaches in 2 universities in Colombia. He's a prolific author, lots and lots of books and I don't know, hundreds of articles. And I had the great honor of working with him to co-edit our latest book, Pluriverse. Arturo, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ashish and Shristri. Great to see everybody. And what I've been doing over the past 25, almost 30 years has been working mostly with Afro-Colombian feminist and environmental organizations in Colombia and other parts of Latin America on issues of defense of their territories and cultures. And something that has become very clear to me over the years is the fact that many of these struggles are the struggles for the defense of the right of communities and peoples to exist as the kinds of communities and peoples that they are and they wish to be. And this is a dimension maybe of debates about democracy that is rarely discussed because it goes beyond the nation state. And this is what maybe we can call it a pluriversal democracy or the pluriversal dimension of democracy. And what I mean by that is the democracy that would fulfill or respect the rights of peoples to exist as the kinds of peoples that they are. We could call it ontological democracy, if you wish, or the ontological dimension of democracy, if you wanted to use sort of the fancy academic word of ontology. And so this dimension is very important to me. Is basically was put on the map by the Zapatista of Chiapas when they started to talk about the pluriverse as the world where many worlds can fit. Meaning by that again, where all peoples can have the right to exist as the kinds of peoples that they are and having their own ways of being and doing and thinking. And finally, that for me, this is also a very important dimension of the struggle against terricide. And terricide is a relatively new concept that has been coined by the indigenous movement, the movement of indigenous women for buen vivir, for well-being or collective well-being in South America. And in the belief that we all live under ontological occupation, the occupation by one particular way of being and thinking about the world, globalized, capitalist, heteropatriarchal, and so forth. And hence that liberation has to have also that dimension of both being a pluriversal strategy, but also one that is against terricide. Thank you.
Thanks, Arturo, introducing a new word, terricide, and maybe you can go a little bit further into that in the second round. So we're going to launch straight into the second round. What I've seen, I'm not in any way going to attempt to summarize this first round, but I've seen there's some very interesting common themes, but also possibly some contestations or small tensions, especially, for instance, between the exclusive or predominant focus on radical democracy and the focus on still working with the state, both of which probably have their own legitimacy. The importance of popular education, of feminist and eco-feminist approaches, looking at or questioning borders and boundaries as we see them today, the point that Sherwin, for instance, mentioned, and the crucial importance all across of people's assemblies, of deliberative processes in which everybody can take part. Okay, I'm going to do another round now, and instead of 7 minutes, I'd request 5 if it's possible, because the first round has been a bit longer than what we anticipated. And I do want to make sure that we have at least 45 minutes or 1 hour for the other participants to jump in and give comments or ask questions. For the sake of ease, I'll carry on with the same sequence. Kali, one of the things that I think in the movements that you spoke about, and from what I know of your work, is on the notion of power itself, and I think you've sort of briefly mentioned it. How do you think the kind of movements you've been part of sort of challenges the currently predominant notion of what power is, which is power to dominate, power to sort of hierarchical power? How does your work kind of transform that into a different notion of power, and what does that then mean for democracy?
5 minutes. Well, let me start by saying, our movement has been very much not only focused on trying to transform the capitalist system. It's also been very much focusing on trying to dismantle the system of white supremacy as it expresses itself here in the United States, and the very particular types of power over that embodies. Now that's built upon heteropatriarchy. It's built upon a particular notion of Judeo-Christian kind of authority and orientation, and all of these combined, have seriously limited and distorted the practice of anything resembling democracy in our context. And I think it's very keen on what we say in our movement time and time again, is that for those of us who live inside of this project, we have not known democracy. It's not something that we've experienced in any fundamental way. What we have experienced are various types of logics and practices to get those who have been subjected to these practices to buy into their continuance is the only thing I could really, put it, to get us to rationalize and justify being dominated in this particular way, and to validate it. And you see that really breaking down here in the United States on what happened with this insurrection in Washington, D.C., wherein one of the major kind of animuses and reasons behind that is how this particular framework is being challenged and is being dismantled, and why there's such a reactionary movement to try to reclaim old positions in society, or the traditional positions in society, particularly by the white men who make up the vast majority of those who participated in that movement. And so we've been very much trying to dismantle that project, not with the aim of dehumanizing another group of people. That's not the aim. That's not the objective. It's actually about how do we humanize ourselves and reach our full potential on the small little precious, blue-green planet that we inhabit, that we're going to share with each other regardless, because there is no other place for us to go. And so we have to figure out, how we're going to make this work. And the challenging in trying to invert these notions of power and possession and containment is one of the critical things that we have been really trying to grow into, and really trying to do a lot of work in our community, particularly the last couple of years. And I think COVID has made this even, brought this particular point home about how we need to be in close proximity in practice with each other, so we understand what all of our needs are and how do we collectively practice these needs and then communicate about what we want. Because the way in which, what I mean by the way in which the shutdowns here have happened have been focused primarily on a public health or public safety kind of narrative. But what they leave out in our case in Jackson, Mississippi, is that not everyone in our community has a home that they can kind of retreat to and isolate in. We have a tremendous houseless population in the city of Jackson, which is only growing. And the way in which certain things are framed as power and privileges within the policy actually just aggravated more of the public health crisis, because it just revealed, tremendously, that these type of policies are based upon certain power relationships, certain property relationships. And then if we don't try to intervene and transform the state to deal with these particular issues, there is no fundamental way that this system as it presently exists could do anything to stop the spread of something like COVID-19, because it's not based upon care. It's not based upon transformative relationships. It's not based upon a real practice of empathy and connectivity. And so these are some critical things that how we are trying to re-articulate power so that there's power at every level, within every practice. And it's not easy. I don't want to get anybody any false notion that this is something that you can theorize and then experiment with it and automatically comes into being, because there's a tremendous amount of re-socializing that we have to do so that we see ourselves beyond our particular points of either privilege or being oppressed in order to be transformed and to be transformative in the process. So for us, we've just experienced a tremendous amount of bumps in the road of trying to build a different society. But I would argue that it's well worth it. The alternative of continuing with the path that has been set us before us, rooted in capitalism, rooted in heteropatriarchy, rooted in white supremacy. This is the second time I've heard this term terroricide within the week. So it's one that I'm definitely adopting and trying to bring into our movement, because that is what it's aiming for. And if we keep following this path, our species won't be here too long. That's the reality of, I think, what we're facing. And we have to bring this kind of notion of transforming ourselves and transforming the system through connectivity and connected relationships from the bottom up. I think the challenge is very notion of decentralized power, if not kind of eradicated aspects of it, at least power over from our minds and from our lexicon.
Thanks, Kali. I think this mix of honesty, not trying to sort of pretend that everything is rosy and it's going fantastic, but also the hope of the kind of transformations that you're attempting and already making on the ground. That's amazing. And when you mentioned no hope for our species, I also remembered that maybe the 8th space on this panel should have been for the rest of nature. I don't know exactly how, but we should always remember that there's 50 million other species, or I don't know how many, 500 million other species that coexist or should be coexisting, allowed to coexist with us on the earth. And how do we bring them into our notions of democracy is also something that we should always keep in mind, I think. Thanks, Kali. Ruth, I'm going to shift the question a little bit. Of course, they're all related. But given your struggles with the movements in Kenya and other parts of Africa, including of resistance. How do you think the sort of combination of resistance and creating constructive alternatives could challenge authoritarianism or the currently sort of undemocratic forms of democracy?
Okay, so I just first of all want to start and say that children are playing outside. So if you hear any screaming, nothing bad is happening. Children are basically being children. Your question is very important and has been very important to my work personally, but also in the movement spaces that have been very privileged to be part of. One of the things that I must say is that our work around ecology, for example, one of the things that has been very, very clear to us is that, resisting within the physical boundaries or the age-old colonial boundaries of the nation state can no longer deliver anything for us as movements, if it ever could. We've seen in the last decade, whether it's the seed and trade laws that criminalize the rights of peasant farmers to save, sell, and exchange their seeds. These are laws that are not just being passed in Kenya, in the parliament in Kenya or the parliament in Uganda or the parliament in South Africa or Nigeria. These are laws that are being passed at regional economic bodies. So it has meant that ecofeminist movements, movements for ecology, movements for rights, have had to think radically about coming together, as collectives from across different countries with colonially imposed borders to resist not just the power of one, autocrat or dictator in one particular country, but to think through the creation of the kinds of spaces that we have, thinking about borders. They are fluid in as much as, the material impacts of having these borders remains very, very real, especially to those marginalized, to the oppressed, to the wretched of the earth, if I should use the particular term. But I think, again, to go back to the fact that transnational organizing work has been very central in terms of thinking through power, thinking through about alternatives, because you can't just have alternatives in one local space. You have to think about power, not just in your own area, whether in Nairobi or Kisumu or Kampala, but you have to think about power collectively across different spaces. And that has been difficult to think through. I want to romanticize the idea of transnational or transversal organizing on this continent. Again, as I've said, we have colonially imposed borders whose material impacts and effects are very real to so many people, especially those most marginalized and on the front lines of multiple and intersecting inequalities. Of course, as I started out earlier in my initial presentation, talking about how NGOized the organizing and movement work has been. And
this
the
is
need...
low. It's low.
Okay, I'm sorry. Again, going back to the NGOization of our work and our radical politics. And that's why radical political education, radical feminist popular political education has become very central to so many of us, not just to recover as a process of recovering radical memory or recovering memory, but also as a process of seeing what new worlds are possible. Right, not just as a process of resisting, right, but as a process of regeneration, as a process of building towards a new world of liberation that we see. So this for me, I'd say, has been very central in terms of thinking about alternatives, right? The recovering of the memory work, thinking through how different collectives come together and think about the state, not as just one country in one particular space, but thinking about power, in much more complicated and much more nuanced ways. And of course, as feminists, has also been to complicate even the notions of power, the notions of resistance, is co-creating worlds in which those of us who are feminists, those of us who are queer, those of us who are not the normative idea of human, who is supposed to belong, can actually not belong. I don't want to use a liberal idea or understanding of belonging, because we're not interested in, liberal diversity and inclusion, but we're interested in shaking the foundations of the system and co-creating a new world where all of us can be there and be in that space in more radical ways. So I'd say that for us, these two processes have been very instrumental in us thinking about, a collective or a transnational form of organizing. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. Maybe, I got one or two questions, but we can come back to that in the discussion round, and then you'll get some final words also. Thanks for that. I'm going to move to Sherwin. I think, in your initial remarks, you spoke about the need to and how you looked at the dissolving of the boundaries, the nation-state boundaries within which the entire Kurdish and other ethnic communities are living. What are the sorts of key lessons that are emerging for a process of democracy which attempts to, in that sense, dissolve nation-state boundaries? And what are the sorts of specific relations between, let's say, the community on the ground, the commune or the municipality, and the larger entire Kurdish Rojava or the Kurdish territory?
I think one very important point, or what also made this process in Rojava possible, was to have a clear view about the basic principles and methods, what do we want to reach, how do we want to live, how do we want to organize. So the concepts of democratic autonomy, or in connection with democratic confederalism, that were developed by Abdullah Öcalan, who is imprisoned still in solitary confinement in Turkey, have really given a very important theoretical foundation for the small steps that were done in practice, and also are a kind of measure or measures where we can relate our praxis towards. So I think, like, on one hand, to have very clear the principles, the methods, to connect them with your aims on this way of building up an alternative system, is one hand, but on the other hand, also we learned that it is important to be flexible and use different methods and tactics on this way, which is full of obstacles, and in which hegemonial powers and nation states that that are in conflict with each other try to squeeze you in the middle. So any way or any forum that we can use for limiting the power of the state on people's lives, and for creating the possibility to speak freely, to think freely, to determine our own lives, we have to develop this. One point of this can be also to join mechanisms of representative democracy, but how much do they really exist? For instance, if we look at North Kurdistan in Turkey, the majority of elected members, they are today arrested, and they have been displaced by dictators from the government that Erdogan sent to these places. And so even if you use these kind of mechanisms, there's no guarantee in anything. Still, we are also demanding official recognition of the self-administrated region here in North and Eastern Syria. But at the same time, we know the system doesn't have much interest in it, because they are focusing on how they can exploit and divide the resources in this region. The very basic or the most important thing is that really this process of aiming at reducing and overcoming the influence of power, of state, of hegemonic powers in all aspects of life, that we take this as our basis, like to strengthen the self-awareness, the political engagement, and the ethical values like justice, solidarity, and respect in the whole society. It's just, also a process of the different cultural, religious groups overcoming this place of dividing and ruling, getting to know each other. And this was a process that really happened for the people here during the last decade. So together organizing communes and people's assemblies, a communal ecological economy, people's or cooperatives, academies, self-defense forces, in which all the different communities participate in. This is the guarantee for the survival and for the future. And at the same time, it is challenging the concept of a nation state, which never had brought any improvement to the societies here. It has been an instrument of colonialism in the Middle East as well as in other parts of the world. So I think instead of trying to put the focus on how to reform the state, to really name and see that the state is not serving the people, but always has been an instrument of power and ruling over people. So to focus on building up alternative structures from the grassroots, this is what we really have to concentrate on. And maybe there are many obstacles and shortcomings that we have here. Maybe not everything is functioning as it is in the theory, but it's a constant process of reflection, self-reflection, of trying to do it better. And also a system cannot be built up within 1-2 years. But you try to solve a problem, then a new problem appears in front of you, and then you come together, you think what needs to be done, and you find new ways. But I just want to give one example about like the Corona crisis that is now going on all over the world. We have been in touch with many people from different countries that say like how they felt desperate in this time of lockdown, how lonely they are, and that the health systems have collapsed in the richest countries. But of course, we know why, but it's interesting to see that just when this happened here we were able in the women's village in Jinwar, which is, I think, for the first time in this geography, that a communal way of living, of producing, of decision-making has been organized by women. There has been opened a women's clinic under the name Shifa Jin, which means healing women. And they gathered, like young women, old women, gathered the knowledge about natural medicine, healing practices, local knowledge. And they have been able to respond to the needs of the people, not only of the village, but in the surrounding and in this region and the surrounding villages. So while on one hand, health system is collapsing here, although we have the embargo, although none of the UN supplies that are sent to Syria is reaching even this region, with our own capacities and possibilities, we are trying to find solutions, and even some advancements have been made in ensuring a better health or healthcare for the people here. Just to give this as one example. And maybe another thing that really moved us or was very important for us during the last days, when we started with the building up process of genealogy, and we, in many regions, women came together and set up regional research centers. The first one had been opened in Afrin in 2017, and 1 year later, not even 1 year later, it was occupied by the Turkish state. The center was destroyed and its members were displaced. But 2 weeks ago, some of our members who were displaced from Afrin, they opened again a new genealogy research center in Shehba. This is now a region where hundreds of thousands of people from Afrin are living in tents and refugee camps. and daily they are confronted with a shell bombing of the Turkish army. Children, women, casualties we have day by day. But women from Sherpa, like in this region, said that genealogy brings a seed of strength and hope back to them. And this connection to life, this hope, is the biggest remedy against the despair and the hopelessness that is imposed by the system on the people.
Thank you, Sherwin. I think for most of us on this call, it's very hard to even imagine being in a situation like this. And the fact that the community can still do amazing things like the Genealogy Center and community-based research and all the other alternatives is extremely inspiring. Pedro, you spoke a lot about popular education and the need for radical education for creating change and transformation. But you've also lived through dictatorships or fascist regimes. How do you combine the resistance to these sorts of regimes with alternative popular education, and what kind of lessons emerge from that for democracy?
Bem, eu acho que a gente tem alguns sinais recentes na América Latina importantes, esperançadores, e às quais a gente deve dar atenção antes de falar dos casos do Brasil. O primeiro deles que eu mencionaria são a experiência das assembleias territoriais no Chile, né? Que foram estão sendo uma base muito importante, né, de diálogo, né, com o povo chileno, com os seus problemas cotidianos, né, e com toda uma metodologia, né, que está dando suporte à organização dessas assembleias territoriais e que deu sustentação, né, para todas as mobilizações na Praça dos Indignados, né, durante todo o período das grandes mobilizações, e que deu sustentação também, né, para as mobilizações pró-constituinte no Chile. Então, acho que essa é uma experiência importante. A segunda que eu mencionaria é a mobilização dos movimentos de mulheres, dos movimentos feministas na Argentina, né, que recentemente aprovaram a lei do aborto, né. Uma terceira manifestação importante, né, é a retomada da democracia na Bolívia, né. Quando parecia que nós estávamos diante de um golpe que duraria muito tempo, né, para ser revertido, né, a organização dos movimentos indígenas, camponeses e do próprio MAS, né, Movimento Alternativo ao Socialismo, né, permitiu que no prazo de um ano, né, se retomasse o processo democrático na Bolívia. No caso da Colômbia, né, o Arturo pode falar mais, mas a manifestação que ficou conhecida como La Minga, né, manifestação de indígenas afro-campesinos que conseguiram romper o cerco do confinamento, cerca de 5.000, que fizeram uma marcha da região de Cauca a Bogotá, reivindicando, né, a questão da paz, a questão da vida nos territórios, né, e a questão da democracia. Então, são todas formas de resistência que conseguiram, digamos, golpear os regimes fascistas, né? E produzir alternativas. No caso do Brasil, né, eu mencionaria aqui a experiência, né, do movimento dos trabalhadores sem terra, né, que, a partir das experiências nos assentamentos, né, as experiências de resistência, né, e que, com um fortíssimo trabalho de formação política, né, através de escolas que abrangem todas as gerações, desde as crianças, né, os jovens, os adultos, né, um trabalho muito intenso de formação política, né, conseguem produzir hoje, né, uma política nacional de agroecologia. Né, e com isso, né, chegar a níveis de produção mesmo agrícola, né, bastante significativos, o que fez com que, por exemplo, neste período da Covid, né, o movimento pudesse desenvolver ações de solidariedade, né, com as populações urbanas, né, que enfrentavam situações de fome bastante significativas, né. Citaria também a experiência do movimento dos trabalhadores sem teto, né, aqui no caso, movimento urbano, né, que, a partir das suas ocupações em áreas urbanas, consegue, a partir de um forte trabalho também de educação popular, informação, consegue produzir moradias populares a partir de um processo autogestionado, né, acessando fundos públicos. Né. No plano da democracia representativa, eu citaria uma experiência que é mais recente, que é a experiência dos mandatos coletivos, né, que são experiências que buscam romper a legislação eleitoral vigente e eleger representantes parlamentares, né, através de um processo em que passam uma pessoa eleita formalmente, mas, na verdade, são eleitas mais de uma pessoa junto com ela, né, representando vários segmentos sociais, sobretudo mulheres, negras, LGBTIs, né, e que são fruto, né, de um trabalho coletivo e que exercem coletivamente esse mandato, com forte controle social sobre o mandato, né. Essa tem sido uma experiência muito significativa de ampliar, né, os limites da democracia coletiva, da democracia representativa, no plano do legislativo, né. E a experiência a qual o Boaventura já se referiu, né, dos orçamentos participativos, né, que ainda em alguns municípios onde a gente tem governos progressistas, né, significa a possibilidade, através de uma participação direta dos cidadãos, né, de discutir o orçamento municipal e de definir prioridades de aplicação dos recursos públicos. E isso se estende para outras definições em relação à vida do município. Então, me parece que esses são sinais, né? E em todos esses processos, né, A educação popular é um suporte fundamental, né, para assegurar que se desenvolva consciência de cidadania, né, consciência de que esses são espaços que são direitos dos cidadãos.
Thank you, gracias, Pedro. Eva, I'm going to turn to you with a maybe slightly provocative question, which is because you mentioned that one can't really rely on the state anymore, if one could ever. And so the crucial importance of focusing on deliberative, radical participatory processes, radical democracy on the ground. Some of what we're hearing from Pedro and earlier what Boaventura had said is also the need to continue working with the state in terms of policy shifts or making it accountable to actually be the guarantor of rights and human rights and other rights and also welfare. So do you think there is a tension between the two, or can the two go together in the work that you're doing? What's your experience?
Yeah, thank you. I think we have to do everything, and that's okay because there's lots of us, so we can all do different things. I think it's essential that people are working with their local authorities and their national authorities to try to make the best situation for people on the ground that they possibly can. At the same time, the initiative that I'm involved with is very squarely looking at the possibility that we could do better, and really trying to experiment and collaborate and connect around how we build a completely different system. And that needs time for those conversations to happen, for those processes to mature, for people to fall out and work out how to deal with conflict between them, because that's what always happens with people. We always fall out. But there are really good ways of using our conflicts to create new scenarios that we maybe hadn't even imagined. And I think that it's really important for us in looking at how this other system might be to identify, what's at the core of the system that we have that isn't working for us. And people here have expressed it very well in different ways. The way that we express it is that it's a system of domination that has kind of come out of the whole colonial process and has been active on the colonized countries and the people in them, but also in the colonizing countries. And where it works most potently is actually inside of each of us, because it's traumatic to live in a system of domination. It's traumatic to be a dominator, and it's traumatic to be dominated. We're interested in this role of trauma because it is a kind of an inherent physiological process that happens for all of us around different things, around insults to our autonomy, one way or another, right from when we're very small children. And when our trauma kind of exists in patterns that live in our nervous system and in our bodies, and when it is triggered, we actually stop being able to think properly. We start thinking as that trauma. And you can see this happening in lots of people in government who are continually in the grip of their trauma and are completely unable to empathize with other people. We think that and I think I share with the rest of you the belief that our systems of governance need to be founded on empathy, and so being sharp and aware to what trauma is, to how it's happening, and to when it's happening in us, each of us, at any moment, and to develop the skills and resources to be able to deal with it, both in ourselves and when it happens between us. Is absolutely essential to making this new politics different and much less able to be co-opted and corrupted in the way that the previous one has. We have to get it right this time. You know, as Callie was saying, we don't have long in terms of the kind of our actually ability to subsist on the planet. And that urgency that is now even being felt by, you know, the middle class. We all feel the urgency in different ways, and for some people, the kind of crisis of capitalism has been acting on them and their communities for centuries. For those of us in the richer countries, you know, who've done okay, who've been born into relatively affluent families, the climate crisis hit like a ton of bricks. It's like that was the thing that we noticed. And somebody in the chat was asking about the wretched of the earth and the big fight, the big pushback that happened when Extinction Rebellion was saying the climate crisis is everything, nothing else matters. You know, you won't be able to poverty doesn't matter if your planet has died, and you know, all this kind of very naive way and very superficial way of seeing what was happening. I think was part of the kind of maturation process. Certainly for our project, we're seeing that climate change is just another symptom of the same system where the intention is to dominate and control, and also to stratify us. So there's always somebody who's got a little bit more power than us, who can enact it on us, and there's always somebody below us who's got a little bit less power, and it keeps us apart from one another. So that kind of whole inner process, I think people have been pointing at in different ways, but I feel that it's really crucial to get our heads around it and to understand it, and to have that kind of it's honesty and it's vulnerability, because if we acknowledge our trauma, it can be really frightening. And yet I feel that that's one of the keys to creating a different system that is really truly human. And that's a lot of what we're doing in this project, is looking at, so how do we create the conditions that we're told that we're essentially greedy and competitive and violent by capitalism? Well, we know that we're collaborative and loving and sensitive, and actually it's our conditions, it's the conditions around us that enable us to step into those more pro-social ways of behaving. So how can we create the conditions that mitigate our least social aspects and support our best? There's hundreds of examples, and there's lots of kind of deliberative and direct democracy processes. There's loads of traditional and indigenous processes. There's systems like sociocracy for decision making, which are incredibly helpful tools, and we need everything that we can get to be able to create this kind of pluralistic, very diverse network of processes that somehow need at some point to come together. Yeah, and we're particularly inspired by the kind of People's Assembly idea. So People's Assemblies are broad and wide. They call in anyone who cares about this issue, whether they love it or they hate it, and then tries to create these kind of engaging processes. The best way to take power over people is to bore them. It's like we have to create processes that are juicy and exciting and interesting to be part of, with trustworthy information and good facilitation for people who maybe have never been in those kinds of situations before. And maybe these can be the drivers of the good solutions, of the new solutions. Citizens' assemblies are much more kind of narrow. They're a representative sample of the population who's having to decide. Just a much smaller number of people, but they're very well resourced in terms of being able to call for different kinds of information through expert witnesses. They're very well facilitated, and they're given time and space to really think things through and talk things through and listen to one another. So it's not done in this kind of urgent context where many of our decisions in kind of ordinary democracy happen. And maybe those could be the engines that then decide between these different new policies that have been coming out of people's assemblies. So we're seeing, yeah, okay. There's loads more.
Please. Sorry, I thought you'd finished.
I'm happy to stop there. I've probably gone on too long.
Thanks, Eva. And I think you brought out the crucial importance of the inner dimension, sort of looking within ourselves and the dealing with trauma and of humanizing, which is something that Kali also mentioned. It's not about demonizing the other, but how do we actually humanize ourselves and everybody else around us to make these things happen. I'm going to ask Boaventura, again, maybe a slightly different question, which is that, to my understanding, Western liberal democracy has either erased or displaced a whole lot of traditional ways of governance, not all of which were necessarily democratic or socially just, but they were there. And some of them are coming back or have been sustained in indigenous peoples or other communities. In this whole notion of decolonizing epistemologies, but also decolonizing democracy or governance itself, what do you think is the potential of other forms of, traditional or other forms of democracy or of governance in to move towards more socially just and ecologically sustainable systems?
Thank you. Wonderful question, Ashish. Well, I've been thinking it has been a very rich panel, and quite frankly, I think that each period struggles and resists with the weapons at hand. So we have to start from what we have. There was a time in which there was a centrally commanded type of revolutions that were very transformative. We are not there. What do we have? Diversity. Epistemological diversity, political diversity. This panel is a very good demonstration of that. What some people call different forms of democracy, I would say demodiversity. Even we have been using this concept of demodiversity because I think that we need as much biodiversity as we need a demodiversity. So we have this diversity. The second point of our time is that the global power is very arrogant. They think they have defeated all the enemies, and they have been thinking that since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are so much really trapped that I liked so much what Eva just said, because the question of honesty, of trauma, because after all, we are talking about our needs within the silos of capitalism. Look how much money we are giving to the owner of this platform, Zoom, while we are speaking. I mean, this guy made millions and millions of dollars in the last 2 months. So in order to be anti-capitalist, we have to run the capitalist system. I mean, it's in a sense. This should give a sense of humbleness to our work. So I start from the assumption that one of the characteristics of our time is that domination, in fact, acts globally and in articulation. Capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And the drama of our time is that resistance is fragmented. Some people are very interested in struggling against capitalism, but not against racism or against sexism. Others probably focus solely on anti-racism, but they leave aside the anti-capitalist struggle or anti-sexist struggle. So I think we have to unite the resistance. And I think the World Social Forum could be a very good instrument to unite these struggles. So what do we have now? We have institutions, we have streets, and we have communities. This is the three that we have now. And I think we cannot waste any one of those, quite frankly. And it is really wrong if we start thinking that one struggle is better than the other in general. Struggles are very different according to different contexts. Some things that can be done in Europe cannot be done in Africa or in Asia and vice versa. And even in a given country, what can be done in Scotland cannot probably be done in Wales. I mean, we never know. So I think that we have to be very contextual. So we have to work with, and that would be my idea, is that one foot in the institutions and one foot outside the institutions, extra institutions, the streets. We on the left, that's why I consider myself We have not the monopoly of the streets anymore. We know that the extreme right is ready to go to the streets and take over, take control of the streets in many countries, even my own country. So I think that we have to start from that. If you do that, then we cannot wait struggles, and we have to work with the different institutions, because as Pedro was saying, even the liberal democracy reconstructs itself, renews itself, and you should use these opportunities. So the institutions that we have are the state, human rights, democracy, law. These things. Different countries, you can use them in different ways, but never just rely on institutions. If you rely on institutions, you are doomed. The only way, for instance, I've been in the Bolivia and the Ecuador very active, and I'll be very active in Chile now. And what I'm telling them is that please learn from our mistakes in the previous decade, because we managed to develop a new constitution. And when the new constitution was there, we dismantled, because after all, the victory was there. We had a new constitution. Now, on the contrary, this is the first day of the struggle that the constitution is going to be defended, because otherwise the movement to undo the constitution will start right away. It did that in Ecuador. It was the case in Bolivia, and it will be the case in Chile. So I think that we need all different kinds of struggles. For instance, one in my work, for Rojava, and I'm so pleased to have served in here. I've been, collaborate with people, David Graeber, great friend that was paid so much attention to Rojava. We need liberated zones. And I think they are a liberated zone, as the Zapatistas are a liberated zone. But there are other strategies. We have to work with the states. And what is the state? The state is an abstraction, because you can work at the municipal level. For instance, even in India, look at India. If you look at the figures on the pandemic between Kerala and the state of India, there are two different realities. In Brazil, between Niterói or Araraquara and the federal state is a different story. So you have different realities in a given state. And then don't forget the global side. We may be very much enthusiastic about our grassroots movement, and we should be. I've been all for it. And I've been working basically at that level. But I have to say that I'm here representing what we call the group for the renewal of the World Social Forum, because we think that we need a global dimension on this. We need some a political actor at the global level, democratically built, based on deliberation. What kinds of deliberations and how we reach them, it will be a problem, and we'll have to discuss that, and we have time until Mexico to decide on the best ways to deliberate. But we need, in fact, a global voice, because we don't have a global voice. And this global voice is not really to undo or to silence all the diversity of voices that are throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Europe, and throughout Latin America. So I think that we have to, from now on, to be working with this plurality of struggles and learn from each other, because the only way I can overcome the trauma, quite frankly, as Eva was saying, is that we feel that we are not alone. So someone is out there discussing with us. So that's why I think we should have at the World Social Forum more communication, so that people know. How many people in the World Social Forum now know what Rojava is? It is really remarkable. They know a bit more about the Zapatistas. But, I can tell you about thousands of other initiatives. What the indigenous people in the Cauca region, the ones that created the Minga, I've been working with them in Cauca and Cali. I mean, the richness of that movement. That's why I'm working with the Constitutional Court to bring the idea of the plurinational state, because they are the ones that they are being assassinated every day. So they are in the front line, like the health services. They are in the front line because they are being killed. How can we do that when we have a narco state like Colombia is and the necropolitics? like global capitalism. So my salute to all of us is that we have to work at all scales, the local scale, the national scale, and the global scale. We cannot really, and of course, that's a very important discussion that we don't have in our movements, Ashish, and with that I conclude, is that we don't know how to distinguish between important struggles and urgent struggles. Important struggles are all the struggles because that go against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. But in a given country, at a given moment, some struggles may be more urgent than others. So let's move from there. And if we do this, then we can expand our concept of democracy. And Arturo was saying about and Evo about nature and so on. Well, we are moving in that direction. We have already rights of nature. We still don't have democracy of nature, but we are getting there. And I think the ecology, the deep ecology is leading in that direction. That's where I am. So I think that we have to be very humble, open to this diversity, but at the same time, pay attention. Domination is global upon us and is right here. I mean, because we know that our data are being collected by them at this very moment. So we are not outside. Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, Bo. I think this distinction you just made between important struggles and urgent struggles. This is so very crucial. I mean, and it's there even within a sector. Right now, we have the farmers' movement going on in India, and the urgency is the repeal of the 3 laws, which is further commercializing and commodifying agriculture. But there's a equally important longer term struggle of redoing agriculture itself in terms of sustainability and equality and so on. All right, Arturo. I had a whole bunch of issues for you, but I think just going a little bit further on this whole issue of decolonizing democracy, and you mentioned earlier sort of pluriversal ways of looking at democracy. So how do you think we can think of like multiple forms of not democracy as one homogeneous way of looking at it across the earth with elections and blah, 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 but sort of multiple different ways of democracy in which, in fact, truly it is power of the people, which is the original meaning of the word. And how do you think sort of what would be the ways of trying to bring some of these together? Arturo.
Okay, thanks, Ashish. Thanks everybody for the wonderful contributions and answers and questions on the chat as well. And to get to your question, Ashish, I will make a difference between what I will talk about what I think are 2 open questions in both activist practice and in social theory. And I'll mention them in a moment, but I wanted to start first by bringing into the foreground something that Ruth mentioned, which is the perspective of the wretched of the earth, the damné, the famous and very important concept from Frantz Fanon, and Eva also mentioned that concept. And remembering this wonderful work by the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter, that coined this concept that she says that we are trapped within a mono-humanist notion of the human. A mono-humanist notion of the human, Western bourgeois, liberal, secular, rational, and so forth, and that it has basically expanded and colonized all other ways of thinking and being human today. But also she said that if we really want to begin a process of emancipation from that notion of the human, we have to build on the perspective of the damné, the colonized, the wretched of the earth. So in a way, this is to me, the highest stake of all is how do we learn how to live differently? And I think the compañera from Rojava mentioned that as well, is the struggle is part of the struggle against capitalism and patriarchy and so forth, is how do we live otherwise? How do we liberate ourselves from the straitjacket of this particular way of being human that Sylvia Wynter traces very well historically and politically. So the 2 open questions for me are, the first one is, and especially once we know that the liberal theory answer to these questions is no longer working, and the Marxist answer to these questions is insufficient, then how do we answer these questions? And the first one is, what is social change? What is systemic change? What is social transformation? What is radical systemic change? And the second one is, what are radical alternatives that can help us along that path towards that transformation that we envision and we want? And so how do we bring about social change through these radical alternatives? And I'll talk a little bit about both of them. So these two strategies, I think, that are very important, that I see as emerging from below, especially answers from both activist practice, to some extent also in connection with academic theory. The first one is the strengthening of local autonomy. And this has come up very clearly to me in the answers and conversation here today. And the strengthening of local autonomy has to do with at least 4 other processes. The first one is the recommunalization of social life. Anywhere we are, we have to contribute to reconstitute a certain sense of a communal way of being, because globalization has been the destruction and the war against everything collective and everything communal. The second one is the relocalization of social activities like food, very, very important food. Paulo mentioned agroecology, that's a very important dimension of it. The relocalization of cultural activities, political activities, local democracy, grassroots democracy, and so forth. The third one is and this comes from Latin American feminism very clearly, is the de-patriarchalization and de-racialization of social relations. It has to be done simultaneously. We need to build non-patriarchal and non-racist ways of being. And the last one, the fourth axis for strengthening local autonomy, is the reintegration with the earth in some fashion, and that can be spelled out, obviously. Now, to answer these questions, it cannot be done only theoretically, and I think Kali mentioned this when he says we cannot just think our way through these questions through theory. It has to be engaged within the practice. So what we see in the practice emerging from many social movements and collectives is grappling with these different issues and these different axes of transformation. And the last thing that I will mention, and this gets to some of the points also that Bo was making about the global dimension of these systems of domination, is that if we need local strategies for building and strengthening local autonomies, we also need strategies of interweaving among radical alternatives. And I have learned quite a bit along the way from the GTA, from many of the work that many of you have been doing, from people's assemblies, for instance. It is about how struggles can connect with each other and build mutually enriching, even from critical perspective, but mutually enriching networks and self-organizing networks of networks that really have a possibility and the potential to make a dent on this very strong systems domination that we are facing. And maybe the final thing that I will say is that then in thinking about the confluences and the convergences, and for me, there emerges this different level, I don't know how to call it, but call it a meso level, the meso level of thinking about strategies for the connection among alternatives, regional levels, which can be also transnationally conceived. For instance, now we're trying to build processes by the convergences between radical alternatives in Colombia and in Mexico through the concept of crianza mutua, the mutual co-emergence or co-nurturing of radical alternatives from below. And I think that's a level to which it makes sense to start paying attention today. So thank you, Ashish, again.
Thank you, Arturo. That's been quite an amazing range of things that the panel has brought out. I wish we had many more hours to go into some of these things even deeper and wider. But we have already many questions that have emerged in the chat box, and Shrishti is helping me with tracking them. I'm going to put the questions. I will try and see if I can address them to particular panelists, but that may not always be possible. So any of the panelists can please feel free to jump in. The first one is about how do you describe the key principles for radical or of radical education? how can education escape the reproductive nature of liberal democracies and allow radical democratic imaginaries? Pedro and I think Ruth kind of partly already referred to this. Does either of you want to say anything further for this question, Ruth or Pedro?
Okay, it seems like I'm going to go. Okay, so I'm going to answer that question with, I mean, of course, going beyond, I mean, not going beyond, but like the work that we do, of course, is grounded in Frere's work on pedagogies of the oppressed, but also is grounded in, centuries old, ways of indigenous ways of knowing and cosmologies of African women on this continent and feminists on this continent. And I think for us, when we think about political dedication, and how it moves away from sort of the banking model and the depoliticized models that we have in very many places, not just in the formal education system, but also in so many so-called radical organizing spaces. And for us, it has always come back to what are our visions of liberation. The ways in which we have thought of what political education means to us has started from the framework of what do we envision liberation as? What is the political project of our organizing work as feminists working on ecology in the country, I mean, on the continent? The second question for us has always been, whose aspirations do we want to center in our organizing work? So for us, political education isn't simply about this grand theoretical or grand conversations that we have, but it is basically one of the key tools of resourcing for the kind of radical work that we need. And of course, to again mention what Kali has said, and I think Boa or Arturo has, spoken back on that.
Eu queria falar sobre. Eu penso.
Yes, Pedro, we will get to you. Let Ruth finish, please.
Okay. All right. Okay. So it's not just about this grand theoretical thing that we are doing, right? We are resourcing for the kind of movement and organizing work we already do, whether it's, Women Seed Savers in Kenya, who, despite the fact that we have legislation that criminalizes using of non-certified seeds, them defying the order, and of course, passing down their knowledge from, intergenerational knowledge around seed saving. So it's basically, what is our political project? That is the first way to think about how we structure radical political education. It starts from that, and then it goes to whose aspirations are we centering? Again, going back to, we are centering the aspirations of the wretched of the earth. We are centering the aspirations, of the most marginalized, those on the front lines of multiple and intersecting crises. So we start from there, and that's how we begin to think about whether it's the radical curriculum that we have. So that is how we think about the possibilities of political education being radical and not just this chain system or capacity building system that many of us often find ourselves in when we are sort of working on when we're working on ecological politics, or working on any radical thing.
Thanks, Ruth. But that kind of radical education would also, of course, have to be oriented at changing mindsets in the ones who are not the marginalized, right? I mean, the ones who are dominating. So we need it, I guess, across the thing. But what you're saying is the concerns and the knowledge systems of those who are marginalized need to be at the center of that. Pedro, you wanted to add something on this. Pedro? Pedro, are you having a difficult.
Ok,
You are unmuted
agora.
now, you can talk. Yes.
Sim, agora.
Yes.
Eu penso que uma educação radical, para uma democracia radical, ela tem que envolver três princípios, né? Três princípios básicos. Ela deve ser uma educação para a decisão, para a deliberação. Não existe democracia radical em que as pessoas não são chamadas a decidir. Segundo, ela deve ser uma educação para promover a autonomia e a emancipação individual e coletiva das pessoas. E terceiro, ela deve ser uma educação no sentido de promover o desenvolvimento da compreensão dos comuns, no sentido daquilo que é comum. Então, eu penso que esses são três princípios fundamentais. A metodologia, né, ela deve estar fundada naquilo que Paulo Freire chama de uma educação dialógica, né? E essa educação dialógica é aquela educação que se desenvolve, né, a partir do reconhecimento, né, da multiplicidade de saberes, né, ou que Boaventura chama de ecologia de saberes, né, que devem estar presentes na prática, né, na prática educativa. Né? E essa educação radical, né, ela deve produzir, portanto, né, uma transformação dessas estruturas. Ela só tem sentido na medida em que ela promove efetivamente uma transformação dessas estruturas, né? Uma ampliação dos espaços de representação, uma democratização radical, né, das estruturas de representação. Então, penso que essa tem sido assim a compreensão da gente do que seria uma educação para uma democracia radical.
Gracias, Pedro. Thank you. We have a question which I would have liked to ask Kali, but I think he's temporarily had to step out to take his kids to school. But there's a question for Arturo which is connected. So maybe, Arturo, you could deal with both of them together. So the first one is, should radical activism be more aggressive in its discourse, denouncing and trying to dismantle publicly the lies and false promises of the fascist capitalist power, to give grassroots activists a powerful message under which we can see ourselves building other worlds? And connected to this is, how do we connect such struggles, our struggles, in a way while ensuring that connectedness strengthens the community's capacity for self-determination rather than undermines it, and certainly rather than absorbing them into some new form of capitalist or state system. Arturo, are those two clear?
Yes, I think they are okay. Brief answer for now. I think there is plenty of radical activism that is aggressive today, certainly in the global south. Both Pedro and Boaventura have mentioned the Minga, this wonderful movement indigenous movement from Southwest Colombia that has this project of the liberation of modern Earth. And it's a very sophisticated, politically and theoretically, a movement. And it's very explicitly anti-capitalist, non-statist, anti-patriarchal, etc., etc., etc. And at the same time, I think it's very important, and I think this is something that is emerging with greater clarity in many of these circles. I think Kali mentioned it and Eva mentioned it, maybe some others mentioned it, of having a politics without enemies. And a politics without enemies, because if the understanding of life that we want to convey is an understanding that life is interdependence and interconnectedness and relation from the get-go and all the way down, from the beginning of life to today, is all about radical interdependence. Ubuntu, I exist because you exist, I exist because everything else exists. Then enemies are part of that weave of interdependence that we have to heal and care for. That doesn't mean that anything goes. That doesn't mean leaving them off the hook. That doesn't mean not speaking truth to power. All of those things have to be done, but also without building a politics that is just anti this and anti that and anti that, but also a more prescriptive, more what is the word, that makes more propositive kind of politics. Okay, and in terms of the, yeah, this is the sort of the dance between autonomy and heteronomy, I guess, between strengthening local autonomy without aiming for any degree of closure or pure purity or any of that, but always open, because reality is open. Reality is pluriversal. I mean, but what I see in communities that are building autonomy, autonomy is a preparation for weaving, interweaving with other struggles, with other communities, with other people, but under more symmetrical conditions. Without a certain degree of autonomy, no strategy of relocalization or recommunalization has any success for any chance to succeed. So autonomy is very important in order to then begin to weave with other struggles and so forth. Okay, that's what comes to mind, sort of in a short way.
Thank you, Arturo. It also brings to mind the Indian notion of Swaraj, which you are a little bit familiar with, which is really about autonomy, individual and collective autonomy, but in responsibility to your autonomy and your freedoms. And one can extend the your to not just other human beings, but also other species. And so building that sense of responsibility and restraint as a preparation for building the larger networks and sort of global movements, I think would be very important, and also something what I think Eva and others were talking about, looking inside and building a more humanized discourse. Okay, there's a question now on which is kind of partly already answered by Boa and others, which is about the role of the state, but also the role of international or multilateral agencies like the United Nations. Given that I think Boa has already mentioned that we need to work at all these levels, there is sort of legitimate action at all of these levels. Maybe I can actually ask Shervin what she thinks is the possible role. Is there a role, and if so, what is the possible role of, let's say, the United Nations framework, the United Nations frameworks on human rights and others? Has that been of help in their struggles, in your struggles, Shervin?
Well, at first you have to be recognized as a nation or as a state in order to have a voice at the United Nations. And for the Kurds, this hasn't been the fact. Solving the crisis in Syria, so far no legitimate representative of the autonomous region in north and eastern Syria, which is about a third of the population of Syria, is not represented there. And those that are invited to these official platforms are those jihadist forces that have been built up by Turkey and are a part of the war and terror on women and the people here. So they are seen as an opposition. They are invited to these talks, but there's no representation of the people's councils, the whole system of democratic autonomy that has been established. So of course we will continue also the struggle that this gets acknowledged, but it's still such a far step, and I don't know, if not a pressure, international pressure from many sides, in cooperation is done on this mechanism, a local struggle itself that is not according to the interest of capitalist powers, state powers, hegemonic powers, colonial powers, won't be able to open these doors. But I believe that if we can really build up a confederal system of people's autonomy worldwide and connect this in an effective way, so that we make the system that is not functioning and that is a reason for the crisis, ecological crisis, human crisis that we are living in, then we can also open maybe these doors. But we cannot, like one of the friends gave the example of the elections in the US. Of course, there are different presidents look different and have, and maybe under different presidents you have different limits of which you can use for developing your struggle to create conscience and so on. But in the core, it's a state system, and for the Middle East, we still don't know. We don't can give hope on that with a new president in the United States, the problems will be solved. If we don't rely on our own strength and on our own strength of building up and finding solutions for the problems that society faces, and we don't have the strength of self-defense, then it won't be. We cannot give this trust or anything in the international mechanisms so far. Because we always have made the same experiences again and again. So I don't know, until really an international struggle for the acknowledgement, official acknowledgement of the democratic autonomy, self-administration in this region is not carried out. It looks very hard.
Thank you. So, I mean, obviously there are limits to the UN because it is based on a nation state model. But there are different realities. I guess there are parts of the world where for things like the human rights instrument would have been useful for the local struggles. So like I think Boa or somebody said, there are different realities and different levels. Okay, there's a kind of related question, which is about global philanthropy. What would be the appropriate way in which global philanthropy could support transnational organizing of movements, which all of you have spoken about, in a way that doesn't make it an NGOization, which has unfortunately happened to a lot of the transnational or global processes? Who would like to take that on?
I'm not particularly familiar with the experience of receiving philanthropy, so I didn't have a huge amount to say, but I was thinking about it recently. I think that any people with access to large amounts of wealth who want to support these kind of initiatives would need to give their money completely without strings. And if they were to attend, would need to attend as an individual rather than as a representative of the holders of that money. Because I think that we're all too familiar with the way that funds can drive mission rather than the other way around. And I think that necessity for people to attend democratic processes as themselves rather than as representatives or in role really extends beyond just funders. For me, it's quite crucial that I think that when certainly within my culture, I'm sure about within others, but within the UK culture, when people are in role, they actually are not being fully human. they're being part of a hierarchy, and there are certain things that they're not allowed to think, and there are certain ways that they're not allowed to feel, and to express empathy and what they really think or what they really feel. That may be at the cost of their job, so they won't do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why climate change, the attempts to deal with climate change is so slow. It's like nobody will speak out. I've had experiences of people speaking out of role, saying they're frightened for their kids' futures, whereas where in role they would never say such a thing. So yeah, sorry, strayed slightly off the question there, but I think that sense of attending as a human rather than as a representative is really important.
And of course, the big question of how does one democratize the philanthropic institutions themselves? But that's a subject for another whole webinar, maybe. Boa, you wanted to add quickly to this point?
Oh, I think that we have to be very clear about our enemies. That's the point. I mean, there was a time in which we were more clear about our enemies, and today we are not so clear. I think that for me, global philanthropy is a bad word. I mean, quite frankly, it's absolutely detrimental to our objectives. I mean, it's the way of appeasing the false consciousness and bad consciousness of the wealthy of the world. I mean, it's the social responsibility branch of the World Economic Forum, basically. That's what it is now. So I think we should be really, absolutely against it. Philanthropy is the opposite of the commons, is the way that we care about each other, is caring. But for caring means some kind of reciprocity. I mean, I care for you because you care for me. We need reciprocal care. Philanthropy is just the opposite. You need me, I don't need you. Unless, to cut in my taxes or to appease my conscience. I don't want to appease the conscience of our enemies. I think that we are at a time, and if we do not really be a bit more aggressive and create fear to the global powers, they are not fearful of us. I mean, they are listening to our discussions here and they are laughing. I mean, these are crazy guys that are deciding, but they are using us. We can just turn them off and they are gone. Because, if they can't use the Zoom, what can you do? So the arrogance of these people is tremendous, Ashish. So I think that we have really to create from bottom up. This, what we were discussing, the islands of liberated zones, the islands of these different global tapestries, as you are building, and we are in different ways. The idea is that to move from the islands to the archipelago. I mean, we need that our islands are in an archipelago. Could the World Social Forum be an archipelago? Could your global tapestry organization be an archipelago? Yeah, it could. But we need a new mental geography. And we have to do that, very autonomously in this way. And I see the NGOs, did a lot of damage to the World Social Forum in the last 20 years. And they are still doing that. So they are infiltrated inside the World Social Forum, virtual social forum. So yeah, let's be more clear about that. We are so nice people that we really don't like to say some nasty words against some people that are doing much damage. Look at vaccine and the Bill Gates Foundation and the vaccines, what the big pharma are doing. I mean, it is absolutely scandalous. It's a crime that they are committing before our eyes. And this virtual forum is going to do nothing or say nothing about the next crime, the big pharma crime, corporate crime, will be the vaccination of the world. We should do away with patents, of course, but they are not ready to accept that. And I don't see many people doing this at this point. So Ashish, let's really be more aggressive in our actions and in our deeds, in a sense. Down with the global philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. That's very straight, put very straight and frankly, and I tend to agree with you. One of the questions, and I think this relates also to everything people have been saying, is we haven't really spoken about youth and youth power. And unfortunately, there's nobody really that young in the panel. Okay, some of you are, sorry, I haven't guessed anybody's ages, but maybe Sherwin is probably the youngest, or Eva might be. But anyway, the question is, how do your movements engage the youth, 14 to 20, and this is really young people? Do they do, and if so, how? So we don't have time for all of you to answer this, but who wants to take it? Maybe, I mean, I would personally be interested in seeing how does it work, say, for instance, in the African context or in the Kurdish context.
I can very briefly. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about in terms of the pillars of political education for the collective that I'm part of is, one of the strong pillars is cultures of the liberation, or liberation cultures, which borrows from Amilcar Cabral's revolutionary work around using culture, as a point of reference, but also as a revolutionary strategy and tactic. So one of the things that has been very key for us is using film and art and graffiti, in terms of as a space to, conscientize and use it as a form of, space for radical and political education. I mean, one of the things that's often very strange is that we see art and culture sort of relegated to the very end. Musicians, artists, sort of like, or, poetry, things like poetry, sort of used they come at the very end. We talk serious stuff. And then at the very end, once we finished our very serious conversation, that's when we invite the artists to come and entertain us. It's very often and very unfortunate that we don't think about art, as a form of liberatory tool in very radical ways. And I'm saying this as someone who is, and I see the radical work. I mean, we saw it in Argentina and in Chile, the use of music, for example. We've seen it in, the South African Revolution. One of the things we say on the continent of Africa is that one thing that South Africans will always do is that they'll always sing, that their liberation always has music. So I would say that our use of art, music, film, poetry, literature has been such an incredible entry point for young people, to feel part of a space, but also to explore their creativity, right? And also to locate art and liberation culture as also as a process of commoning, because music, because art, because film, these are also spaces of commoning, but they're also spaces of rejecting privatization. I mean, and I come from a continent with very long histories when you look at liberation movements, not just Amilcar Cabral, but you look at even Africa's music. This is music that was used to be supported by the state, for example, has a long history of being, supported by the state, but also supported by ordinary people, so I think that is an important entry point, that we need to think about cultures of liberation and cultures of the revolution, not just as those nice things that we used to entertain ourselves with after we have these serious discussions, but actually as part and parcel. And I think it has been very incredible for us to see how young people have responded to being introduced to histories of the continent through music, reading various scholars, through graffiti. This has become very, very important because it's something that they co-create, and we sort of leave that space where I am the knowledge keeper and I'm the one transmitting the information. But with art and culture and music and film, you get a collective of people co-creating something together, which of course begins to ingrain the principles of the commons rather than, these heroes who liberate people.
Thanks. Ruth, quickly, Sherwin, on the role of young people in your movement, and we have to finish in about 6 or 7 minutes, so I might ask one more final question and then we'll start winding up. Sherwin, and maybe you can combine that with any final thoughts you have.
Okay, so the youth movement is also organized autonomously, and they have also built up their own communes and councils organizing in sports, arts, culture, similar examples that also Ruth has given. And inside the young or youth movement, also the young women's movement organizes autonomously. At the same time, they are sending their representatives in all the different fields of the democratic self-administration. So in each of the different commissions from health to education, defense, you have also representatives of the youth councils or the youth movement in it. So on one hand, they can build up have their own discussion processes and can at the same time also share it in the general assemblies. Also for the works of genealogy, there are many young members participating in it. And genealogy also has become a part of the high school education in the education system, school education system that is based on mother tongue or native language. And so it's also for the young generation a way of learn a different way of how to perceive family, of gender relations. So these basic questions are also a part of this discussion that are discussed together with the youth, because also, like we have it in many countries, special warfare like drug trafficking, trying to enforce prostitutions and things like this are also used by different forces to pressure the society, to divide and destroy the society, and especially targeting young people and especially also young women. So also to create a conscience of self-defense against these kinds of special warfare is an important part of the works. For the last remarks, I just wanted to say this. Often some of the other speakers used the term liberated zones. I think that's quite dangerous if we look at them as zones, because then it's something that is separated from the rest of the world. And what we need are strong connections, because the ruling system tries to isolate us, to separate us from each other, closing borders and not giving possibilities to connect with one another. I think we saw, in spite of the borders that have, and even the walls that have been now built up on in the borders dividing the Kurdish territory, the common ideas and the sense of struggle, the spirit couldn't be divided. And I think that examples in some parts of the world where a level of people's self-administration and self-empowerment, alternative ways of economy been established, they are an inspiration for all of us. And we have learned that we can find solutions for many problems if we unite our wisdom and spirituality, our analytic and emotional intelligence, if we unite our political thoughts and statements with the way how we live. And when we transform our needs and hopes into communal organizing and actions. And this is a process that needs to go on, like from local to regional to global levels. And I think that in a time of deep despair, human and ecological crisis, the examples that we have in different parts of the world create hope and give new inspirations. For instance, in this discussion also, there are so many common points, from popular education, from two people's assemblies, to the need for a new epistemology. They are common agendas that we have. And so this is really we have points that show us another world is possible if we divorce ourselves from patriarchy and state mentality, if we organize from the grassroots and connect our struggles with a global vision and also networks and structures, coordinations, which we maybe can call a kind of people's or women's democratic confederalism, which can connect the specific struggles together with a common vision. And in this sense, I think this discussion has also shown us once again how important it is not only to have a vision, but also to connect it with concrete actions and steps. And I mean, 20 years of World Social Forum.
Thanks, thanks, Sherwin. Yeah.
Small steps towards this vision.
Okay, thank you. We're kind of in closing time. I especially want to respect the time of the interpreters because they must be very tired by now. I'm not necessarily going to ask every one of you to have closing remarks, but does anybody want to have? I think Sherwin's final words have kind of encompassed a lot of what we might want to say. But you have a minute if you want, if any of you wants to add anything from the panel.
I'll just say a word,
Go on,
Ashish.
please. Yes.
No, it's just a response, and I want to clarify with Sherwin about liberated zones. The concept comes, as you know, from the liberal struggles I got, from liberation struggles. I got it from Amilcar Cabral, the liberated zones against Portuguese colonialism. Then the Zapatistas also use them. But I'm fully aware of the dangers of all the concepts. I mean, it would be really quite a danger to isolate and to separate. So it's a very good point. I'm going to learn, I'm going to think about that. And I'm ready to revise this concept and at least to contextualize it, because you always to see things from different perspectives, and that's the way we learn. Thank you very much, Sherwin, for that point.
Thank you. As we wind up, one of the requests has been if any of the panelists are okay with putting their contact details for participants to follow up with you later. I noticed that I think Ruth and Boa and Eva have already put. If the others, there's no compulsion. If the others would like to put, maybe some of the participants can follow up, including questions and points that have not been able to be addressed. Any of the other panelists, or can we wind up? I don't want to stop you, but
See?
okay. All right. From the way Pedro is looking, I think he wants to, but he's not able to unmute. Okay, yes, Pedro, go ahead.
Sim, apenas dizer nesse final que nesse ano nós estamos celebrando os 100 anos do nascimento de Paulo Freire, e acho que vale a pena lembrar uma afirmação dele que tem muito que ver com o nosso debate, em que ele dizia que se, por um lado, é verdade que a educação, né, ou a educação popular sozinha não consegue construir a democracia, sem ela, a democracia não se constrói. Então, acho que eu queria deixar essa lembrança de uma afirmação de Paulo Freire para esse debate final. Obrigado. E dizer que aprendi muito com todos e todas vocês nessa manhã de hoje. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. I think that's something that you can say on behalf of all of us. Just a couple of quick last points, and also to announce something that's coming up on the 30th. One is, I think there have been some comments, and we haven't really been able to go into it in any detail, but the links between radical political democracy and radical economic democracy. Already we have, of course, from many of you, notions of food sovereignty, local self-reliance, local autonomy. All of you have in one way or the other mentioned it. Also the need for radical redistribution of wealth, of reimagining and recommoning the private, and many other things, including the recognition of the enormous economic contribution of women and young people and elderly in the care and share economy, which never gets calculated in the normal so-called GDP growth calculation. So there's a lot on that relationship between the political and economic that needs to be teased out much more. There were also comments on why did these social movements not manage to stay together as part of the World Social Forum or platforms beyond the World Social Forum. And I think that's something that's going to be addressed hopefully in the global assemblies that are coming together on the 30th. There are a series of global assemblies where many movements will come together, including, I guess, discussions on the future of the World Social Forum, building towards the 2022, hopefully physical World Social Forum, but also other processes interim and beyond the World Social Forum. I think Shrishti will put for you links to 2 of the global assemblies that we are helping to organize, along with the other 6, with all of the 7 global processes that she mentioned right in the beginning. I wish we had much more time, of course, but then staring at a screen is also, for such a long time, is also not such a great idea. So this has been, at least for me, and I think for a lot of us, an incredibly stimulating discussion. My mind is a bit like we have this festival of Diwali in India, which is lights and crackers all over the place. So that's what my mind is feeling like right now. It's bursting in many different good ways. I hope we can, in different forums and platforms, continue some of this discussion. This is also about building relations around the world for movements of different kinds. And I'm very, very happy to have been able to moderate this discussion. I'd like to end by thanking a number of people, the 7 global processes that put this together, all the 7 panelists, the interpreters, a big hand to all the translators. They've done an amazing job for 2.5 hours. It's not easy to, especially to follow people like Ruth and me who speak very fast. But that's been amazing, and including impromptu interpretation from Malcolm Cox for Sherwin in the chat box, and the Global Tapestry, another team that has put this session together. Rosie, many thanks for also coordinating all the tech stuff that you helped us with. So, muchas gracias, obrigados, thank you.
Gracias,
Good night
Ashish.
from
Thank you
Thanks,
so
here.
much,
Ashish,
everyone.
Pristri. Bye, everybody.
Happy to meet you, everybody.
And for everybody, we will put up the recording. There's also 4 live streams. So I think recordings are happening in French, Spanish, and English and Portuguese. So we will have it available in 4 languages. Rosie, is that correct? Anyway, I think that's the message I got. So hopefully we'll have recordings in 4 languages.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sehr geehrte